I'm Laura Sparks, the president of the Cooper Union, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the 2017 John J. Iselin Memorial Lecture Series. J. Iselin was the 10th president of the Cooper Union. He was also a visionary in public broadcasting, having led the nation's largest public television station, WNET, here in New York for 14 years. There, he originated and produced iconic programs like Great Performances, Live from Lincoln Center, The Nation, and the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. I've also learned that Jay was a direct descendant of the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, so it seems exceptionally fitting that in his honor, we gather this evening to hear from another legal trailblazer, the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Mr. Preet Bharara. On behalf of the Cooper Union Board of Trustees and our entire college community, I'd like to extend my deepest thanks to Lee Iselin for making this lecture series possible in honor of her late husband, John J. Iselin, and to her children, who are also here with us tonight, Benjamin, Kathy, Josie, Fanny, Allison, and her husband, Daniel. We also send a long-distance thank you to William, Lee's eldest son, who is in London. And luckily for William, as for so many others near and far who were interested in being here, the Cooper Union is live streaming tonight's event on YouTube. So if you have friends or family who would love to hear what Mr. Bharara will have to say, send them a text. Tell them to tune in now at www.youtube.com/thecooperunion. The man of the hour joins a long lineage of men and women who have broken barriers in this historic hall, advancing critical thinking, new ideas, and the voices of others who have been marginalized. Some of the most important speakers in history have stood here to present, contest, and shape the issues of their day. It is here that Abraham Lincoln made his famous Right Makes Might speech, arguing against the expansion of slavery and launching his bid to the presidency. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton advocated and organized here for the woman's right to vote. Early meetings to form the NAACP took place here. Before they were elected, Presidents Lincoln, Grant, Cleveland, Taft, Theodore Roosevelt, Obama, and Trump all spoke here. President Bill Clinton made his first major economic speech here, a speech that is said to have set the course for his presidency. The list goes on, and so does the legacy of the Great Hall, with important voices like Preet Bharara here tonight, and Congressman John Lewis next month on May 11th. You are seated in the auditorium where public discourse happens. It's a role that the Cooper Union is proud to serve and has served for over 150 years for our community, our city, our nation. I'm relatively new to the Cooper Union, having joined as president in the beginning of January. And if you are new to the college too, whether here in the Great Hall or watching live on our YouTube channel, I welcome you. And I hope you'll consider this the first of many Cooper Union experiences to come. Many of you are familiar to us. Welcome back. I'm sure that you'll agree that an evening like this is quintessential Cooper Union. The Cooper Union is an American treasure. I say that because of our founder, Peter Cooper's steadfast belief that education is key to personal prosperity and civic virtue, and that it should be available to all, regardless of socioeconomic background, race, or gender. He was ahead of his time when he opened these doors in 1859, and in many ways, he still would be today. Cooper Union remains as true to his conviction as ever. Peter Cooper believed that an education should be holistic, one that is not only technical or professional, not solely intellectual or creative, but rather an education that combines all of these for a more powerful result. A result that enables students to improve their lives and contribute to the greater public good. There's evidence of this in every program inside and outside of the classroom every day. He also founded Cooper Union to play an important role in the political and cultural life of this city and this country, and to empower students to be active citizens who are engaged in important issues. This continues to be a central role for Cooper Union, which brings me back to our guest this evening. As a federal prosecutor, Preet Bharara oversaw the investigation and litigation of all criminal and civil cases brought on behalf of the United States in the Southern District of New York. He supervised an office of more than 200 assistant U.S. attorneys who handled a high volume of cases that involved domestic and international terrorism, narcotics and arms trafficking, financial and healthcare fraud, cybercrime, public corruption, gang violence, organized crime, and civil rights violations. Under Mr. Bharara's leadership, the office experienced one of the most productive periods in its history. Early in his tenure, he formed the Terrorism and International Narcotics Unit. His office was at the forefront of prosecuting financial misconduct, securing convictions of numerous insider trading defendants. His office brought charges against corporations, such as J.P. Morgan Chase, for its relationship with Madoff Securities, as well as numerous high-ranking government officials. He also continued the office's civil rights work, with initiatives like a multi-year investigation into the treatment of adolescent males at Rikers Island. In 2012, Mr. Bharara was featured on the cover of Time magazine and appeared on its list of the 100 most influential people in the world. As we all know, just last month, Mr. Bharara was abruptly removed from his office as U.S. Attorney here in Manhattan as part of the transition to a new presidential administration. I might add that development made Mr. Bharara's talk here tonight one of the hottest tickets in town. We couldn't be more proud to have him here in Cooper Union's Great Hall. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Preet Bharara.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you, President Sparks, for that introduction. I also want to thank Margot Jacoby, Director of Special Events, who I know put a lot of work into this event. I wasn't intimidated enough, and then there was a video about all the people who spoke here. Lincoln was mentioned like 18 times, so I feel no pressure at all. It's been about 3.5 weeks or so since I was fired. For those of you who expected me to be in a David Letterman-style post-employment beard, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I was made to shave it this morning. This is actually, a very, even though I can not see in the back because of the darkness, it seems like a very great and welcoming crowd. And it just figures that the first time in 8 years I literally show up for an event where I can't arrest anyone, I get like the largest sellout crowd of my career. I was saying backstage to the president and to some others that the last time I was here in this great hall, and this is true, was about 7 years ago when President Obama spoke about economic reform and economic regulation. I was sitting, I think, somewhere over there. And I just want to say one thing for the record in front of all of you and the YouTube audience about crowd size. I don't care what the pictures show. My crowd is a lot bigger than Obama's crowd. Much bigger than Obama's crowd. From where I stand here, it looks to be about 1 to 1.5 million people. It's a really huge crowd. Look, that's the information I was given. I want to acknowledge the great institution that Cooper Union is. It's a real privilege to be here in this historic hall, and especially giving a lecture named after the great John J. Iselin. I had an opportunity to meet his wife Lee, and other members of his family in the green room, and it was really an honor to see all of you and to be giving this talk in his name. As you may know, and I think it was mentioned earlier, I didn't hear all of it, John J. Iselin was the great-great-great-great-grandson of John Jay. I am the great-great-great-great-grandson of nobody famous. But I am the son of Jagdish and Desh Bharara, my parents who are in the audience in the front. Thanks, Mom and Dad, for all the things that I'm supposed to thank you for. Thank you. Among other things, it's particularly poignant to be giving a talk in a lecture named after John J. Iselin, given, as many of you know, or should you know, how much of a pioneer he was with respect to public television, particularly at a time when public television seems to be a little bit under attack. I was also saying backstage to Lee that there's a great piece by General McChrystal about the importance of public television and about credibility in the news, and I commend it to your attention if you haven't seen it. I want to give a few bits of thanks. There are a few people here from my prior life. There is a collection of people who were either my chief of staff or special assistants, and they're here somewhere, and they can yell when I say their name. Yui Scribner, Jared Hoffman, Sarah Bodner, and Hillary Naban. Thank you for all you did for me and for being patient. I think there's some former colleagues from my press office here, Jim, Dawn, and Nick. They, for those of you who don't appreciate what that job is, they are the only people that stood between me and the dishonest media. That's called tongue-in-cheek. I believe there may be some colleagues of mine, former colleagues of mine, who are sitting. They don't know I'm going to say it, who are sitting on the third floor of the U.S. Attorney's Office, I believe drinking beer and eating Korean chicken, which is great, but please, when you're done with this, go back to work. I want to thank NYU Law School for giving me a job, Dean Trevor Morrison, and the rest of the faculty for agreeing to have me on as a distinguished scholar in residence. My father-in-law was really happy to hear that I was going to have a job. Among other people. But I want to give a more general thanks to all the people in my old office, a place where I loved that place like people love their family, and I can't talk about all of them, but I want to single out one person. I don't know where he is, but my friend, and for years, the criminal division chief, the deputy U.S. attorney, and now the acting United States attorney for the Southern District of New York, June Kim, is here. He's the boss now. He has the subpoena power. And I want to say a couple of things about June. He is as fine a leader and legal mind as I know. And he cares about the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice just as much as I did. He is smarter than I am, which is helpful. And to the extent people might think incorrectly that things change just because I'm gone, they're wrong about that. I don't know who the future leader of the office will be, and leadership certainly matters. But I know so long as June is in the office, that everything that we were doing according to what we appreciate our responsibility was, which is do the right thing the right way for the right reasons, with that office's trademark excellence, integrity, and independence will continue absolutely unabated under June. So June, thank you for your friendship and thank you for your leadership of the office. So I'm no longer the U.S. Attorney, that's been established. And I just want to say a quick word about that. If you want more details, there apparently is a New York Times article that came out this afternoon. So briefly, I was asked to resign, and I refused. I insisted on being fired, and so I was. And so I will tell you that I don't really understand why that was such a big deal, especially to this White House. I had thought that's what Donald Trump was good at. I had thought that's in part how he got to be the president. I mean, after how many people remember the dramatic moment on The Apprentice every week when Donald Trump sat at the conference room table, manned up, looked the contestant directly in the eye, and said in that voice, "Would you kindly submit your letter of resignation?" I don't remember that. So, I just thought he should be comfortable doing what he knew how to do best. So I thought I would spend a few minutes looking back at some of the things that I did while I was the U.S. Attorney and a few minutes looking forward. So, overall, I was in that position for 7.5 years. And as I said to my office on the day that I left, and I will say many, many more times going forward, being the United States Attorney in the Southern District of New York, no matter how long I live, will forever be the greatest professional honor of my life. And I have no complaints. I have no remorse. I got to do that job longer than most people get to do that job or a lot of other great jobs. I think I was the second or third longest serving person in a long time in that position. But I want to make an important point further to my thanks to Jude and the rest of the office. I led the office in name, but the hard work and the labor and the accomplishments that have been celebrated by people in the city and in the district and in the country were all done by the most hardworking professional men and women of that office that I've ever seen, along with their partners at the NYPD and the FBI and the DEA and the IRS and all the other amazing federal agencies with whom we work. I had the best team in the world, and I don't know any institution that is as good as that one. And so any accolade that I got, any award or honor that I received, I always received on behalf of them, because they're the ones who did the work, they're the ones who got the job done. So, overall, I think that the office did pretty well. We don't keep track, and I try not to keep track of specific statistics. We're not in the widget business, we're in the justice business. One statistic, though, I kind of like, and that is over the course of 7.5 years as the U.S. Attorney, we did bring back to either victims through penalties or disgorgement or asset forfeiture, $14 billion, and yeah, that's a lot, right? On a budget of about $50 million a year, so if I'm doing the math correctly, and given my background, I should be able to do the math correctly. It was 37 times so the return on investment from the taxpayer was about 37 times what the cost was, which is a lot better than pretty much any hedge fund I'm aware of. So you tell your hedge fund friends that. We spent time on some things that didn't get as much attention as some other things. Gang violence and the brutality that exists in some of the housing projects and streets and neighborhoods, not just in New York City, but also other communities in our district, including most prominently when I first became the U.S. Attorney, Newburgh, New York. I mean, there were moments, and people didn't focus on this as much as some other stuff, but the people in my office made a real difference in other people's lives in places like Newburgh, which had one of the highest crime rates in the state. I think it had 2 or 3 times the per capita homicide rate in the state, and it was a big problem. I remember I went once with a couple of deputies to a meeting in Newburgh, New York, where we gathered with a number of moms, mothers against gang violence. And these are professionals, FBI agents, police department officials, and prosecutors. And these mothers we went around the table, and people talked about their experience and how gang violence in Newburgh had affected them. And a mom started talking about how she had lost her son, who'd been shot to death by a rival gang member. And it was a compelling story, and grown men in the room became teary-eyed listening to the story. And just when you thought, what could be worse than that, the next mom spoke about how she lost 2 sons to gang violence. So among the work that we did in the office, it's work that made streets safer and schools safer that I'm really, really proud of. We did all manner of work in the cyber area, and the cyber threat is still with us. We created a civil fraud unit for the first time that brought, I think, important and meaningful litigations against financial institutions and others. We did a whole a lot of civil rights work, and that work still goes on. We spent time trying to keep the homeland safe with our terrorism and national security work. Over the course of time, we not only prosecuted and sent to prison for life Ahmed Gailani and Abu Hamza and bin Laden's son-in-law, but also the Times Square bomber, Faisal Shahzad, and June will preside over the trial of the Chelsea bomber. And it's just worth noting, and I can say this, I think, more clearly, since I'm no longer the United States Attorney, it was almost 8 years ago that Eric Holder called me on a November evening to tell me that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of the masterminds of 9/11, would be coming to the Southern District of New York to be tried in an Article III court, a civilian court. And during the time that has gone by since then, obviously that didn't happen, that was derailed for reasons that were above my pay grade, we have shown in case after case after case that the Article III courts work and that justice can be done in civilian courts. And justice doesn't get hijacked in civilian courts, and the families get closure, and the public gets an understanding of what went on because of transparency. And meanwhile, after all that time, in case after case after case that the men and women of my office successfully prosecuted, I think Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has yet to have a pretrial conference. So I think that record speaks for itself, and others debate what was the better way to go with that. Financial fraud. We did a lot of work in financial fraud and corruption, and I'm extremely proud of what we did there also. We increased the cost of crime. We deterred people. We spurred reform. Did we get everyone? No. Did we eradicate corruption? No. Is there lots more to do? Yes, absolutely. But with the tools we had, and the legal tools, I mean, in what the law requires, I think we did as much or more than anybody else who looked at any problem in corruption or in financial fraud in the country. We helped make the auto industry safer. We made money laundering harder. We made compliance programs, I think, stronger. We had a hiccup along the way with respect to our insider trading cases. We appealed on a particular issue, and we lost in the district court. We lost in the appeals court. But then when it counted in the Supreme Court, based in part on the advocacy of my office and the Solicitor General of the United States, the Supreme Court ruled very quickly that the Newman case was basically incorrectly decided in the Second Circuit. We also fought for consumers. Some of my favorite cases, again, that didn't get as much attention, were these cases that dealt with consumer fraud and predatory debt collection. And many of you may have gotten these calls where people call you up and they say you owe a debt to the IRS or to someone else, and if you don't pay immediately, someone's going to come and arrest you. That terrorizes a lot of ordinary people all over the country, and we did a lot of those cases. There were unscrupulous debt collectors and others who were trying to do harm to average folks, taking advantage of their lack of sophistication, and that's wrong, and we sent a lot of those people to prison as well. Again, I want to say one word about one of our partners in some of those cases, the Consumer Fraud Protection Bureau, the CFPB, that's run by a very able gentleman by the name of Richard Cordray, who's a very qualified guy. Now, I know, some of you may be aware, that there is a very serious litigation that's going on with respect to the issue of separation of powers, with respect to the CFPB and the executive branch. And I'm not going to comment on whether that's well-placed litigation or not, but I can now, as a citizen, comment on what I think is somewhat remarkable, where people are not just talking about the structure of that agency, but denigrating it, and whether or not it's appropriate to be as independent as it is, given our constitutional structure. But separate and apart from that, denigrating the mission of that agency, which, as far as I understand it, is about helping average people and consumers, and so much so, in fact, that the first criminal case that they ever referred to anyone and worked jointly with the U.S. Attorney's Office was with us. They help people, ordinary people, get justice when they're being ripped off. And so I'm confused sometimes when I hear blanket dismissals of public servants in that agency who are trying to do what I think a lot of people were hoping, which is drain a particular kind of swamp. Public corruption, I believe we did some of that. I don't know the exact count, 19 or 20, I think, elected officials convicted, Democrat, Republican, upstate, downstate, rural, suburban, urban. If they were doing it, we were looking at it, and we were trying to make a difference there. We raised awareness of the problem, but I will say now that I have some distance, and as a private citizen, the dream of honest government still seems a bit far away. Prosecutors can't solve the problem, and I've said that over and over again. Ethics reform, people think, still doesn't take center stage, and I think you can blame people for that. That's a problem that's for everyone to solve, not just people in June's office. The public and the press, I believe, still needs to continue to hold people accountable, and other watchdog agencies too. And by the way, when a public corruption commission gets abruptly shut down for nonsensical reasons, you're allowed to be angry about that, and you're allowed to call BS when you see it. I abbreviated BS because my parents are here. So I think we did a lot on corruption, criminal corruption. That was the job, punishable by law and imprisonment. I'm out of that business now, and that work remains with people like June and those in his office. But there is still, by the way, for the rest of us to think about, insidious corruption all around us, harming all of us. And it's not corruption that can necessarily be proven beyond a reasonable doubt under a criminal statute, but the corruption of truth, the corruption of standards, the corruption of institutions, and that's the responsibility of citizens to think about. We spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, doing cases that didn't get the kind of attention that the corruption cases and the Wall Street cases got. I think the public may not appreciate how much time the hardworking men and women in my office spent working on cases that ordinary people benefited from, the fights that they waged every day throughout the city and throughout the state, because we did the best we could every day to achieve justice for everyone, often for people who no one else fights for, often for people who have been left behind or left out or left to their own devices, people left to face discrimination alone, to face violence alone, to face discrimination alone, to face con artists and corrupt landlords and countless other predators as well. Part of what the office is about, before I got there and long after I leave, is a quintessential American fight to lift up underdogs by bringing justice to their lives. That includes, among other things, our exoneration work. People know us for convicting people who have committed crimes, but there were people who spent hundreds and hundreds of hours exonerating innocent people, including one by the name of Kathy Watkins and 4 others for a murder they did not commit in the Bronx, for which they spent 17 years in prison. And that was the work done proudly by folks in our office that stood for the principle that we try to run just as fast to exonerate the innocent as we do to convict the guilty. That includes people who live in public housing. If you live in public housing, you also have a right to live in a clean and safe environment. You have a right, our view is, to be free of concerns about lead, free of concerns about mold, of chronic problems, and unsafe elevators, backed up plumbing, and all manner of dangerous conditions. And that's why, while I was there, our civil division began working with HUD to see how we could address some of the problems and make sure that the 400,000 New Yorkers living in public housing are treated in accordance with the law, treated with the dignity and the respect that they deserve. It includes also justice for people with disabilities. If you have a disability and you live in this city, you have a right to equal access to enjoy every privilege of living in the greatest city on earth. If you have a disability, you still should be able to dine at any restaurant you would like. That's why our office launched a series of inspections to bring dozens of restaurants into the 21st century with respect to the ADA. And you should be able to enjoy theater and opera and ball games too. In other words, people with disabilities should be able to enjoy and experience all the greatness of New York like everyone else. It includes people who have been caught up in the criminal justice system. If you have been caught up in it, especially if you are a young person, you have rights too. That's why we spent several years, the last several years, attacking the disaster that is Rikers Island. which I know has been in the news lately, and I'll comment on that in a second. But the cost of a broken Rikers Island is borne not just by the people who are incarcerated there, it's borne by all of us. Because the cost of that culture is the sum of the incalculable expense of an unchecked cycle of violence, of increased recidivism, of emergency and long-term medical treatment, of legitimate lawsuits that the city must settle, and the loss of faith and confidence in our criminal justice system as a whole. So I met with Judge Lippman, along with June and some other folks, with respect to his commission that has recommended the shutting down of Rikers Island, which I understand the mayor has finally endorsed this past week, and I think it's an impressive plan, and I can say that now because I'm a private citizen. And I think we need to wait and see if the jails can be built, if the communities will accept them. From what I know of it, I hope that they do. But we still, by the way, have, even under the most optimistic estimate of when Rikers Island could be closed, a decade of living with the current institution. And so I hope and expect that with respect to the consent order on the city and on the correction system, that they can make improvement until we move to something that makes even more sense. So there was a lot we did. I can't get to all of it, but there's a lot still to be done. And I wish June and my former colleagues all the luck in the world in protecting all of you and advancing the cause of justice in the country. So now let me spend a few minutes, if you'll indulge me, talking a little bit about what it meant to me, both professionally and personally, to be the U.S. Attorney. So what did it mean to me professionally as a lawyer? I would often get asked the question, and I probably will still continue to be asked the question, what is it that you were most proud of as the U.S. Attorney? And I think people are looking for a particular case, a particular verdict, a particular court decision, and that's not the answer as I think about it. What I'm most proud of, to the extent I was successfully able to do this, is to maintain a certain tradition of excellence and independence and culture of doing what's right in that office. And no particular case comes close to being as important as maintaining the overall institution itself. And I think that's true of any institution you think about. You don't judge any place by one thing that it did. You judge it by what the standards are that they subject themselves to and impose on themselves. And I know there's a lot of tradition in this hall, but there's a lot of tradition and storied history in our office as well. The first District of New York, the first U.S. Attorney, was nominated in a handwritten document by George Washington in 1789 on the same piece of paper on which was nominated the first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. So there's a lot of pressure in that office, like there is in this hall, for people to do the right thing. And independence, I think, is one of those hallmarks, as I said, on the day that I left the job. Hallmark, I think, is a touchstone for everything you think about when you're trying to accomplish the administration of justice. Independence and upholding the rule of law, to my mind, is in many ways more vital than a gun, a badge, or a legal degree. Because without fierce independence, justice is not only not seen to be done, but it cannot, in fact, be done. And I have always believed that. This is not something that I thought of and talk about only because there's a new administration. 7 years ago, in an interview with the New York Times, I said, quote, "We are not," meaning my office, "are not, nor should we ever be, a rubber stamp for the White House." And that's how every United States attorney should feel, absolute militant independence, because that's what the people want and are paying for. People have maybe not a clear sense of what I did before I became the United States Attorney. One of my most formative professional experiences was helping to lead an investigation while I was working in the Senate of the Department of Justice, and whether or not it had become politicized, and whether or not U.S. attorneys and others were permitted to be independent as they should be. And there are reasons to be concerned all the time about the independence of your prosecutors. And when that comes into question, then people doubt whether or not justice can properly be done. And it was almost exactly 10 years ago, to the month, that we were conducting the investigation, the conclusion of which showed, among other things, and you always have to be careful about this, showed, among other things, that there were people in the Justice Department back then applying to either become interns or applying to become lawyers through the honors program, which are prestigious positions, that are being determined based on ideology and party. Now, the United States Attorney and the Attorney General, those are political appointments. They're not political positions once you have the appointment. But the idea that politics and ideology was entering into the hiring of the most entry-level, line-level lawyers in your Justice Department was dispiriting. There was also the moment at which Justice Department officials, after the firing of a number of United States attorneys, I think up to 9, sat in a conference room at a hearing in the Senate and said, looked us straight in the eye, and said all of those U.S. attorneys were fired, which obviously the president has every right to do, in my case and in those cases as well. But they sat in the hearing room and they said they were fired because they weren't doing their job properly. They were fired for performance reasons because they were not competent. And I will bore you the long story and the fruits of the investigation. That turned out to be a direct lie because the performance evaluations came back and they were all terrific. So, sometimes people lie and people need to be aware of that. What has serving as the United States Attorney meant to me personally and to my family, especially my parents, and if you'll indulge me on this for a second, because I don't talk about this that much. And for me, having that position meant a lot, particularly given where I came from and how I got here. I mentioned my mom and dad are in the audience. I am the son of a father who came from virtually nothing, who was born 77 years ago in a colony still ruled in the name of the King of England, who later absconded to America with barely pennies in his pocket, but hope in his heart, with a young wife and an infant son with an unpronounceable name, who less than 40 years later somehow became the chief federal law enforcement officer in the financial capital of the world. And now, even after being fired by a president, is improbably addressing a captive audience in a legendary hall where Abraham Lincoln once spoke, which I think is not bad. Which I think is not bad for a kid like me, named Preet Bharara, who hails from Punjab, India, by way of Jersey. And I mean that with great respect to Jersey. And also Punjab. Part of the reason I think this can be true is that the United States has built a system of laws, even if flawed and frequently in need of repair, that enshrines the right to equal opportunity and embodies the sacred American ideal that every child, even a poor or orphaned or immigrant child, can rise higher than that child's parents could ever have imagined. And all of that, by the way, says a lot more about America than it says about me. And so in that vein, some recent events have been especially painful and disturbing, and I think they deserve some focus, and they've gotten some. And I'm speaking of the incidents recently where Indian Americans appear to have been targeted in hate crimes. In particular, I'm talking about the shooting 6 weeks ago of 2 Indian Americans in a bar in Kansas. Reportedly, the shooter asked the 2 men their immigration status before he opened fire. Alok Madasani was wounded. Srinivas Kuchibotla was killed. That mindless murder, along with other incidents, have caused an unfortunate wave of alarm literally throughout India. And there are many reports that people are now afraid to visit the United States even for a holiday. And I'll tell you, that breaks my heart. That people in the country of my birth now fear, in large numbers, coming to America, the country that embraced me and my family and has given us so much. And I don't know if you folks read all the story, but I'm sure many of you did. Even in the midst of that tragic story, there emerges a hopeful one, because there was a Good Samaritan Ian Grillot, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, happened to be in the right place at the right time, or depending on your perspective, in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he was in the bar that night of the shootings. And he waited until he thought that the shooter was out of bullets and then intervened, even though he didn't know them, and it was a stranger to them, to save their lives. But he had miscounted, apparently, and he was himself shot in the hand, and he himself could have been killed. And in a sign of grace and gratitude, as reported last week, Indian Americans around the country wanted to help this hero by helping him buy a home, and presented him with a check constituting the money they had raised, and it was $100,000. And in particular, inspiring were the words that Mr. Grillot spoke when he accepted that gift from the Indian American community in this country. He said, quote, "I do now have a very powerful message, and if I can help empower people and spread hope and love, then why not?" Close quote. That is the America we love, and that is the America we don't want to lose. I think back to maybe my most, if this is a phrase, most favoritist event as U.S. Attorney, and it was presiding over a citizenship and naturalization ceremony a few years ago. And I was so excited that I was going to be able to do this for a lot of different reasons. I asked if I could bring my family. I brought my wife, my kids, and I asked if I could bring my parents too, and they said yes. And then a couple of days later, the organizers of the event at DHS called and said they had a favor to ask, and I said, "What's that?" They called and said, would you think it would be okay if your parents, at the conclusion of the ceremony, led the new American citizens in the Pledge of Allegiance? And I said, yeah, that would be great. My mom is here, and I shouldn't say this, but she was very nervous, so I printed out the Pledge of Allegiance in like 20 font type, and put it on the podium, and we got through it okay. And let me tell you, that is an exhilarating thing to watch. I think there were 75 or 78 people who were being sworn in as citizens that day. And as I said then, and I say to you now, I challenge you to name another country where on any given day, in any given city, foreigners from 31 homelands might be happily swearing an oath of allegiance to a country they were not born in. And you can't do it because there is no such country. Only America welcomes every day populations of people like my mom and my dad who ate biryani before they ate burgers, who learned cricket before they learned baseball, who felt only limits before they felt freedom. And these ceremonies, they happen all over the country every day. And each one, I think, is a fire of hope and promise, and not just for the new citizens, but for longtime Americans too. If you haven't been to one, try going, just crash one. Try going to one, because your heart will swell so big, you'll think you need a cardiologist. And if those kinds of ceremonies become more rare, I think that would be tragic. Because events like that, and what they represent, and what they inspire, they make America great. Now, I don't know the future of immigration in this country. I am not a subject matter expert. I am only a beneficiary of America's welcoming arms. But I love America as much as anyone born here, and so do my parents. And I have spent more than 17 years serving my country because I feel a deep debt for what I have been given. And I know that distinctions are drawn between the future flow of legal versus illegal immigration, and I get that, and reasonable people can differ about that. But one needs to pay careful attention. One needs to watch and listen to what is really being said and what is not being said. Because as we all well know, throughout history, intolerant people have always figured out a way to make certain folks feel unwelcome. Now, throughout my tenure, I've cared about public safety issues, social issues, and justice issues, and I have consistently said, as I said I think at the beginning of this talk, that no serious problem could ever be solved by prosecution alone, whether public corruption or financial fraud or really anything else. Ultimately, the solutions lie with the people, or as the Constitution frames it, we the people. It really all begins with the people. We choose what is important. We choose what news to believe. We choose who to trust. We choose who to put in charge. We choose what change we want. Sometimes we choose by not making a choice. Sometimes we choose by omission. But inaction, inertia, and apathy are all choices too. Bad choices, but choices nonetheless. And now here I am, and I still care about those issues, even though I don't have that job anymore. And I will tell you that I intend to stay involved and engaged in whatever way I can. So I can no longer issue subpoenas or direct the actions of armed and trained men, which, by the way, is a total bummer. That was a joke. But, as a private citizen, I am surrendering neither my voice, nor my law degree, nor my citizenship. And I really do hope that those remain potent tools to effect change in America, because God help us, if we have to count only on people in public office to make a difference. And by the way, I don't have any plans to enter politics, just like I have no plans to join the circus. And I mean no offense to the circus. That was very obvious where that joke was going, right? Look, to be sure, in current times, those of you who follow the news, there seems to have been an increase in engagement. In recent times, there seems to be renewed civic engagement, and that's welcome and good. On all sides, attention to public affairs is up. It seems on both ends of the political spectrum. I believe the New York Times is up, and Fox News is up too, and that's good. There was massive engagement by the side that wanted this president in, and there has been historic, and some would say massive engagement by the side that wants this president out. But some of that is misleading and anecdotal, because involvement by international standards and even by America's own historical standards is still really low. Notwithstanding all the hype and hoopla and hand-wringing, voter turnout in 2016, after all of that, was the lowest it's been in this country in 20 years. So I think the problem partly is, for all these solutions that we're trying to find that we need regular people to help solve, people still shrink from involvement. They still leave things to other people. And why is that? I mean, I think that there are people who spend their entire lives waiting for the chance to make a difference in their community or their country, and for so many, too many, that chance never comes. And too many people forego that chance when it does come around. Maybe some people don't think to try because they wonder what difference can they make just by themselves. They perhaps worry that their contribution might be too small to be worth the effort and the sacrifice. But over time and all across the ideological spectrum, true leaders have long cautioned against that way of thinking. The philosophical founder of modern conservatism, Edwin Burke, once observed, quote, "Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little." 2 centuries later, a man with a decidedly different outlook, Dr. Martin Luther King, put it this way. He said, "Everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics and physics to serve, which is a really good thing. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. Now, our country needs leadership, and not just from the public officials, but from private citizens too. And history teaches that private citizens, even acting alone, can make a profound difference. Here are a few examples just from my time as the United States Attorney. One investigative reporter, Juan Gonzalez, began shedding light on a massive fraud in the City Time Project. Some of you may remember this. And it was his reporting that set us on a path to arrest the criminals who ripped off New York City to the tune of $500 million. I'm going to leave that there. And because of that, we got every penny back for New York City. One employee, David Kester, bravely blew the whistle on a massive kickback scheme at pharmaceutical giant, his employer, Novartis, that resulted in admissions of misconduct and fines of $450 million. He saw that his employer had pressured pharmacies to promote its drugs while understating serious and life-threatening side effects. And you know what he did? He did something about it. One woman, Mary Quinn. Mary Quinn was kidnapped by terrorists in Yemen in 1998. She saw her companions gunned down and killed, but she somehow managed to escape. And 2 years later, on her own, with no government people with her, she trekked to the Finsbury Mosque in London to confront one of the murderous kidnappings masterminds, Abu Hamza al-Masri. She recorded the conversation on tape, and that tape, years later, in a court with prosecutors from my office, became compelling evidence in court to help us convict Abu Hamza and send him to prison for life. I could go on and on. The point is this: there may be a lot of Goliaths out there, but there are Davids too. And I have been so inspired, not just by the daily work of the dedicated public servants in my former office, but also by the ordinary citizens who aided the mission of justice, often through great risk to themselves. That is the holy power of individual acts of courage and persistence. Now that's individuals. Now think what happens when there's power put together in groups of individuals. One of my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut, once wrote this in The Sirens of Titan. He said, quote, "There is no reason why good cannot triumph as often as evil. The triumph of anything is a matter of organization. If there are such things as angels, I hope they are organized along the lines of the mafia." He wrote that a long time ago, so he meant the mafia of the 70s and the 80s. Because we were busy on that, get it? All right. Active citizenship matters. Active citizenship is desperately needed now more than ever, individually and collectively. The fact of the matter is, your country needs your leadership too. Because you know what? There is a swamp. A lot of the system is rigged. And lots of your fellow Americans have been forgotten and have been left behind. Those are not alternative facts. That is not fake news. But I would respectfully submit, you don't drain a swamp with a slogan. You don't drain it by replacing one set of partisans with another. You don't replace muck with muck. To drain a swamp, you need an Army Corps of engineers, experts schooled in service and serious purpose, not do nothing, say anything, neophyte opportunists who know a lot about how to bully and bluster, but not so much about truth, justice, and fairness. Draining a swamp takes genuine commitment to justice and fairness, not just attention to what benefits one group over another or divides one group against another. In a just and fair society, the prosecutor should care about the prisoner, the healthy should care about the sick, the rich should care about the poor, and the mighty should care about the weak. Why? Because there but for the grace of God go I, and because that is what helps make America great. So continue to care about the important issues. I will too, and hope to advance them as a private citizen. I want to make one final point. So my prior job was all about being strictly nonpartisan, and it required independence, not only independence from politics, but independence of thought, and it required facts and evidence as a prerequisite to any consequential action. After all, there's no Democratic or Republican way to try an armed robbery case. I used to joke that there were 3 political parties in America: Democrat, Republican, and federal prosecutor. For almost 8 years, I was a proud member of that third party. And when I think about public discourse and public policy, I naturally take some lessons from the work of my office and its culture. And so I offer this for what it's worth as it relates to the state of debate and discourse in America at this moment. I tell young lawyers all the time, always remember that your opponents in a case are not your mortal enemies, they are your adversaries in an admirable system that aspires to treat every participant with dignity and respect. And I say remember it also, not just to be respectful, but also honorable and honest, because the best and most effective lawyers that I have ever known, the ones who beat us more often than anyone else, are uniformly above board, not underhanded. They are lawyers, not tricksters, and they are men and women always true to their word. And it occurs to me we might remember that in public debates too. Quick story about my past in Washington when you think about what partisanship means and whether or not we are understanding each other in any way at all. I started working in Washington on the Senate Judiciary Committee about 10 years ago, and I was on my way to lunch with a fellow staffer. On the Democratic side, I was on the Democratic side. And we're walking to lunch, and she looks at me and she says, I heard a nasty rumor about you. And I said, what's that? She said, I heard a rumor that you're friends with Viet Dinh. Now, take a step back. Viet Dinh and I had gone to college together. Viet Dinh is a dyed-in-the-wool conservative from Orange County, Vietnamese refugee, was a right-hand person in the Justice Department to John Ashcroft, and conservative in every way, shape, or form. I don't agree with a lot of what he thinks. He doesn't agree with a lot of what I think. And so I get asked the question, I heard a rumor that you're friends with Viet Dinh. And I said, that's not correct. I am best friends with Viet Dinh. In fact, I was best man at his wedding, and I've known him for a lot of years. And this person physically recoiled from me on the way going to lunch. And I tell that story only because what are we coming to when you're not allowed to be friends with somebody who thinks something different from you? And I think a lot of problems you have in the country with respect to divisiveness is that we don't associate with people we don't agree with. And I know some of the people you don't agree with are disagreeable, so don't associate with them. But we become very, very closed to other kinds of thought. And so relatedly, let me just say this. In this time of antagonism and polarization, this time of headstrong faith that your side is always right and the other side is always wrong, the search for truth and justice in the courtroom, back to the courtroom, offers some model. And here's why I say that. In the courtroom, almost uniquely, the quest for truth depends on evidence and on facts. It relies on examination and cross-examination. It abhors assumption and insinuation. It relies on the right of both sides to present arguments and to challenge arguments. And it lets both sides do so without fear of being shouted down or shut down, so long as the presentations are fairly made with respect and decorum, and so long as they do not make undue appeals to prejudice or fear or emotion. And at every stage of the trial, members of the jury are admonished repeatedly to do what? To keep an open mind. Every day, the judge reminds the jury to keep an open mind, and in criminal cases, to remember the presumption of innocence until all sides have been heard, until all facts have been offered, until all fair arguments have been made. That is the best way our law has determined to discover truth and achieve justice. And there, I think, is something strikingly special in that. And we should all wonder whether it provides some guidance for the way to search for truth and justice in our society as well. Because if our society operated that way, if our democracy operated that way, with respectful and open-minded debate, we can wonder whether we would have better laws and better policies instead of just bad blood. I think that's worth a thought. Perhaps the greatest U.S. attorney ever to serve in the Southern District was a gentleman by the name of Henry Stimson. Many decades after he served as the U.S. attorney in the Southern District, more than a century ago, after also, by the way, having served as Secretary of State and Secretary of War, Stimson described the challenge for people who might wish to make a difference in the world. And Stimson said this, quote, "Let them have hope and virtue, and let them believe in mankind and its future. For there is good as well as evil, and the man who tries to work for the good, believing in its eventual victory, while he may suffer setback and even disaster, will never know defeat. The only deadly sin I know is cynicism." That was Henry Stimson. So, yes, let us unrig the system, remember the forgotten, lift the underdog, drain the swamp. Let us do all of those things, but let's actually do it, not just talk about it. And let's do it with goodwill and in good faith. Let's do it as idealists, not cynics. Let's do it with facts, not falsehoods. And let's do it in a spirit of hope and harmony, with love, not hate. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Thank you. So I thought I was done, but apparently I'm going to answer some questions from the president.
Are we on?
Do you want to use this?
Oh, there we go. There we go. Can you hear me? Yeah. Great. So in the true spirit of the Cooper Union, we invited our community to question, and I have a few of the questions that you've selected to address this evening. Love the first one.
Okay.
Is there any chance of hypocrisy becoming illegal?
Do people hear that question? Is there any chance of hypocrisy becoming illegal? I don't think we have the jail space for that. People talk about mass incarceration. I think we would have a lot of problems. Look, I think I understand the spirit of the question. I think people get very frustrated when presumably this person is talking about hypocrisy on the part of public officials, elected leaders. That's not the business of the criminal law. It's probably not even the business of civil law. That's the business of citizenship and people holding other folks who are responsible for them, who take oaths of office, accountable for what they should be accountable for. And so, no one's perfect with respect to hypocrisy, but we should have less of it, and people should be holding folks' feet to the fire on it.
So how has the Supreme Court's opinion in the McDonald case affected prosecutors' ability to bring cases?
Well, it certainly affected the ability to bring the case against Mr. McDonnell, who's the former governor of Virginia, you may remember. So the Supreme Court decided in a unanimous decision basically to narrow the definition of what could constitute the quo and a quid quo, what an official action might be. And obviously the Supreme Court in McDonnell has decreed the law of the land. I think there are reasonable people and reasonable citizens, including those at the Justice Department, who argued to the contrary, that by this decision, these are the words of other people, that the Supreme Court was being naive about how power is actually exercised. And because of the narrowing caused by this decision, I think some reasonable people are right to worry that there's some kind of bad conduct that the average citizen would like to have criminalized that people are going to get away with. And in the real world, where quid pro quos happen, and they don't happen with the exchange of bags of money, they don't happen in quite the explicit way that people sometimes would like them to happen if you're going to prove it in a court of law, it ties the hands of some prosecutors. So there are some cases that the average person would like to see prosecuted that won't be able to be.
So one of the things that I've come to learn very quickly about the Cooper Union community is that people cut right to the chase. Why do you think you were fired?
Beats the hell out of me. I don't, you know. Look, so the President of the United States is allowed to have the services of whoever he or she wants. And after the election, one presumed that there would be a changing of the guard, whether U.S. attorneys or ambassadors or anything else. I, of course, had this meeting with some fanfare at Trump Tower in which the president-elect asked me to stay on for another term. He was very explicit about it, asked me to tell the world and the press corps downstairs that he wanted me to stay on for another term. And then there was this decision to let everyone go, which I don't begrudge anyone, but I've been around the block a few times and I've seen some things that have happened before, and part of the reason I said I wasn't going to resign, I wanted to be fired, I wanted the record to reflect for all time that there was a deliberate decision, not just a bureaucratic sort of non-specific sweeping away of what had been there in the past, but a specific decision to change one's mind and deliberately fire me, particularly given what my office's jurisdiction is and where my office is situated. I'm not making any accusation about anyone, but I've lived long enough to know that you want the record to be clear.
So on that note, your office is clearly prosecuting many cases that people care very much about and that are critical. Do you believe that your departure from the U.S. Attorney's Office will in any way impede any particular cases that you are investigating?
No, and for the reason that I said right at the outset, June Kim's eyeing me right there, because he and all the other professional career men and women in the office care about doing the right thing, doing it for the right reasons, and doing it in the right way, and believe in independence and justice. And I know that June and all the other people who I know in the office, if they get pushed around, they know how to handle it, whether it's from Washington or anywhere else. I don't know who the eventual replacement will be. I presume it will be someone who comes from the same place and ethic of not letting anyone push you around and being fearless in going after whoever it is appropriate to go after, no matter who they are, how much money they have, how powerful they are. That's the hallmark of the office. That's why we're called, jokingly and begrudgingly by some people, not the Southern District of New York, but the Sovereign District of New York. Sovereignty is very important to us. So my expectation, now that doesn't mean that some people think otherwise and think the removal of a particular person will make a difference, but I think that's misguided, and I have every expectation that the cases will proceed apace.
So obviously the new administration has not yet found a new district attorney for the Southern District. What advice do you have for your successor?
Well, don't make the mistakes that I made, and I'll discuss those mistakes privately with the next person. When I became the United States Attorney nominee, I had breakfast or lunch or dinner or meetings with everyone I could find who was still alive, who had been in my position. Very awkward to meet with the people who had died. So I stuck with with those folks. And they all said the same thing, some version of what I said a second ago. And you take the tradition from them. You know, I served under Mary Jo White, who was fiercely independent. You know, she, at the end of her tenure, opened up an investigation against the president, President Clinton, who had appointed her. Now, that's independence. And to a person, everyone said, you know, make sure you don't lose that tradition. And it's the advice I would give June, although he doesn't need it. That, you know, be true to what you think is right. Follow your conscience. Don't go beyond the law, but, you know, make sure you serve the people of your district, and don't let anybody intimidate you or make you scared. Don't care about public will in one direction or the other to bring a case or not bring a case, and follow what your guiding principles are, and that's it. And if you do that, and by the way, and you get out of the way of your prosecutors and let them do their job, because they're invariably and unerringly you know, brilliant and committed and dedicated and loyal to the rule of law, if you do all those things, it'll work out pretty well.
Well, you've been so generous with your time, and I think I speak on behalf of the entire room that we are grateful and proud that you would choose to make your first major public speech since this happened here in this historic Great Hall. Thank you.
Thanks very much.